origin of a state, that how the origin of a state has been looked into from the point of view of different factors and different arguments. Now, in political theory, as it is quite well known, that state in its multidimensional form, its function, its origin, its role, its location, and so on and so forth, has been an issue of debate since time immemorial. Now, when we come to this question of the origin of a state, in fact, we should keep 2-3 things in mind. Number one, that any such theory will definitely be hypothetical, because the thing is that the state has been there since human known history, human beings known history, and therefore it is not that historically we can establish a set of factors which can be called as the factors for the origin of the state. But nonetheless, there has been an attempt in political theory to explain the precise causes, reasons, factors which have played important role in the origin of a state. Now, one thing is also important to remember, that the entire discourse on the origin of a state is basically meant to provide legitimacy to the state authority and state power. Because why should we obey the state? This is a very important question in political theory, and this question of the legitimacy of power and authority of a state basically ask for an explanation that how the state came into existence and why human beings are basically duty bound to obey the power of the state. So, I mean, these are some of the arguments through which the justification is basically created, justification is given for the authority of the state. Now, when we come to this question of the theory of the origin of a state, before I take up 5-6 different theories through which political theorists have tried to look at this question, it is important to remember that when we have an organization or authority, we find a nucleus of a state is seen to be emerging. Now, the Greek writers, the ancient Greek writers, along with some of the thinkers in ancient India, they talked about the state in different form. For example, in India, the Kautilya, his Arthashastra perhaps talks about the different elements of a state, that what are the requirements of the state, how the state can function with the help of certain elements and certain instruments. Similarly, in the this epic Mahabharata, a lot of arguments one finds where you have the discussion of the state authority, legitimacy, and so on and so forth. The Greek writers, in fact, were also very concerned with this question of a state, its authority, its legitimacy. In fact, even the nature of a state, what is basically the importance of a state in human beings' life, so on and so forth. For example, for the Greek writers, a state was both natural as well as necessary institution. So much so that Aristotle, who is considered the father of political science, in fact, he went to the extent of saying that man by nature is a political being. Whoever was not in a member of a state was either a god or the beast. I mean, if anyone is really a social being, then he has to be or she has to be political, and therefore his natural realization of his species character, that is human character, is possible only within the state or the state institutions or state power. So, therefore, for him, man by nature is a political being. It is not just by a kind of choice. I mean, by nature they are political. Now, MacIver, of course differed with this position, and he said that to identify social with political is guilty of grossest of all confusions, because the two domains are different and they have to be kept separate. Similarly, another scholar Barker, he believed that state and society both have same moral purpose, they blend and borrow from each other. But nonetheless, there are different arguments, there are set of propositions, there are arguments, there are opinions which differ on this view. But one thing is that for the Greek thinkers, unlike the other thinkers whom or the scholars whom I cited just now, for Greek thinkers, this state was indistinguishable from society. They didn't make any distinction between a state and society. Anything which is basically related to human being in society has to have a kind of an association or organization called state. Now, the nature of a state, that what has been the nature of a state, there are two issues here, as I mentioned, the origin and the nature. The nature, of course, has been discussed from the different point of view, but today's discussion, of course, will not be able to focus on this. But briefly I can mention that the nature of a state, there have been different arguments. For example, for some theorists, the nature of a state is to be seen in terms of the class dimension of the society, the class structure of society, whereas for others it is basically seen from the point of view the power structure. So, from class to power on this spectrum you can see the variation in terms of the explanation about the nature of a state. For example, there are thinkers, there are schools of thought for whom a state is a necessary evil. It is evil but necessary, and this is something what is called the individualist perception or individualist perspective on the state. Similarly, a state is also at times at times has been called unnecessary evil. It is evil also unnecessary. Unlike individual is not a necessary thing, it is totally unnecessary. The sooner you get rid of it, the better. And here normally we associate this point of view with the anarchist school of thought. Similarly, there is also a school of thought which believes that a state is like any other corporation in society, like any other association. Its sovereignty is shared with number of associations, and this is something what we know as the pluralist school. Similarly, you have also the organic school, which is basically this position which basically believes that state is like organic. It's like the human body. There is no distinction between individual and the state. A state gets its full realization. Individual gets full realization in the state. So, this is also a kind of position on so far as the nature of state is concerned. There is also class dimension. The Marxist explanation of the state is basically based on this premise that state reflects the class material dimensions of society. State basically is the result of the class contradictions, class struggle, and therefore it is essentially an instrument of the dominant or the propertied class to serve their interests. So, there are different explanations, but this is outside the purview of today's discussion. What I will basically focus on in today's discussion is this theories of the origin of a state. Now, the first important, there are 5-6 theories which are to be basically to be seen here. In fact, the first important theory is the divine origin theory. Now, this divine origin theory is very significant, because this divine origin theory in fact looks at the entire issue of the origin of the state from the point of view of the point of view of the rights, divine rights of king. Now, one thing we should remember, that divine origin theory started as the divine try to trace the origin of a state from the point of view of the relationship with divinity, and then moved in direction of the divine rights of king. So, I mean, how this transition took place is something very important. Perhaps this is one of the oldest theory of the origin of a state, one can say. In fact, one can find its traces in the Mahabharata, the epic Mahabharata in India. It has its echo in the Jewish discourse. In fact, even in one can say that even in Christianity, one can see a lot of echo of this theory. Now, what happened that in Middle Ages, a conflict arose between the church and the state, and this is a historical fact, 16th century, 15th century in Europe. And during this conflict, what happened that the conflict was between the church fathers and the state on account of the teachings of the Old Testament. Now, what happened in course of this struggle between the church and the state, this divine origin was transformed into the divine rights of the king. Now, earlier it was believed that a state is a divine creation. Later on, it assumed a different form, that the king has certain divine rights, and therefore it is the king who is the representative of the God and not the church. Because what happened, the authority of a state had to be established in opposition to the authority of the church, and therefore this church state was attacked with help of this divine rights of the king. Now, in England, James I and Sir Robert Filmer were the great exponent of this divine rights of king theory. In France, the Bossuet supported in fact the despotism of Louis XIV on basis of this theory. Now, what happened that the essence of this theory, this divine rights or divine origin, is that obedience to a state is a political and religious duty of every individual. Therefore, a state is a divine institution and king is the embodiment of that divinity. Therefore, one can say that it is a theocratic conception where the state authority and its legitimacy are basically seen from the point of view of its association with the divinity. So, basically legitimacy is derived not from law, not from consent, not from the contract, but it is done with reference to basically the divinity and the dictates of God or association with the God. So, therefore, king becomes the representative of the God. Now, this theory was developed as a bulwark against the competing claims of the church fathers, because what happened at that time when this transition was taking place from feudalism to capitalism, the attempt was to carve out a separate autonomous domain for a state which was subservient to the church and the fathers, church fathers, the papacy. And therefore, what happened that this divine origin theory was used to basically strengthen the position of king vis-a-vis the church. So, this is how this theory came into existence. Now, James I even wrote a book, and the book was called The Law of the Free Monarchies. And in this book he gave a full exposition of this doctrine, and according to this doctrine, kings are the breathing images of God. Now, there are certain features of this divine origin theory. The first important feature is that monarchy is divinely ordained. Number 2, that the kings are accountable to God only. Number 3, the resistance to king is a sin, because resistance to king amounts to resistance to the will of the God, because the kings are the representative of God. So, therefore, these are the 3 important features of this divine origin theory of the state. Now, of course, in course of time this divine origin theory declined, and therefore, what happened that there have been number of reasons for the decline of this divine origin theory of the state. For example, the rise and popularity of the contract theory, a rise and popularity of the contract theory, number 2 the idea of the consent, and number 3 the secular outlook of the modern man. All these things basically separately or collectively one can say gradually led to a situation where people started losing faith in this divine origin theory of the state. Now, the second important theory of the origin of a state, which in many senses one can say is the modern, and that is of course the other theories are also modern, but I mean this is one theory which basically becomes the premise of modern democratic state system, and this is called social contract theory. Now, according to the social contract theory, the state is the result of deliberation and voluntary agreement on part of the primitive man emerging from the state of nature. So, I mean in this theory there are 2-3 things which are very important. A hypothetical state of nature is constructed, and then it is basically shown that how in that state of nature what kind of condition prevails, and because of that conditions how people are forced to think in terms of getting out of that condition through the instrumentality of contract, and that contract results into the formation of something called state. Now, this contract I mean this state of nature, in fact this pre-civil or pre-political period, that is state of nature, in fact is regarded by some as also pre-social. So, pre-civil and pre-political is for some people also pre-social, that even this state of nature did not have even those conditions which are important for calling it a social. Now, what happened that through this contract or the covenants, according to this theory, what happens that a political society is set up. Now, what happens that because of the setting of this political society, when people enter into contract in this state of nature, what happens that natural liberty is lost. But what happens that even at the loss of natural liberty, people gain something more substantive, and that is basically the security and the protection, because what they lacked in this state of nature, that everyone had liberty, full liberty, but that liberty had no meaning, because no one knew that what was his own and what was others. So, therefore, what happened that this contract created a situation thereof where of course this absolute liberty was taken away, but in place of that what people secured was protection and security provided by the state and political law. So, I mean this is something very significant, that this contract is an instrument through which people basically seek to attain something through which they can make their liberty, their freedom more meaningful. So, basically this is a hypothetical, this argument is entirely based to basically justify certain conditions, the political conditions which are required to basically required for human beings to realize their human life, and therefore this realization is possible only by having this type of an arrangement. Another important thing is this contractual nature of this argument, that it is called that a state is neither the creation of God, nor it is basically the result of force, nor it is something else. What is the state? And the argument is that a state is basically the result of the contract. A state is the result of the contract, and this contract is basically important because the consent, the people have consented to this authority, the state authority. That means that entire state power authority is legitimized with reference to the consent of the people, and therefore this consent plays important role in this entire contractual theory. Now, what happens that this social contract theory therefore is considered to be the basis for the modern democratic engagements in recent times. Now, what happened that there have been various interpretations of the social contract theory, and in fact there are three important thinkers whose ideas, whose writings have been considered central to this this theory: Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. In fact, of course, in three different periods in history, and therefore their uses of the contract has also been different from each other. For example, what happened that this social contract, there are some thinkers who argue that this contract is agreement is between the rulers and the subject, and therefore what happens that the institution of political government or political and political, in fact what is the nature of that contract, it is argued it is a political contract. Now, the contracting parties are also something very significant here from the point of view of these three thinkers about whom I just now mentioned. Now, the individual themselves, in one set of argument, it is this contract is among individuals themselves agreeing with each other and agreeing with all, and in second set of argument you have this contract is between the people in their corporate capacity and on the other hand the agent of the ruler, and this is basically the second set of argument. Now, apart from this, for some proponents of this theory, it is actual historical fact. It is not something like a kind of imaginary or hypothetical situation which conveys some philosophical truth. It is actual historical event or historical fact. In this category, of course, the political thinker Locke comes. Similarly, on other hand, you have some thinkers for whom it is a historical fiction which conveys philosophical truth, and here you have the German philosopher Kant. So, I mean, this has been put to different usages with different purposes. So, there are 2-3 things which are important here to remember, that this has been used by different people, different thinkers, different scholars from different point of view. For some it is a historical fact, for others it is a historical fiction, for some others it is both pre-social and pre-political, for other it is not pre-social but only pre-political. So, I mean, this way one can say that the thinkers are not unanimous on the nature of contract, but one thing is very significant: the purpose of this theory has been to justify and legitimize the authority of a state from the point of view of consent. That legitimacy of a state power is not from the point of view of its association with God or divinity, but from the point of view of human beings. So, what has been argued that basically this theory, what it did, that removed the God from the chair and put basically human beings in the chair of God, because now the sovereignty, who is the ultimate sovereign of the state, who is basically the sovereign, the king, God, or the citizens, the people, ordinary people. This theory clearly establishes that it is the people, it is ordinary citizens who are basically the sovereign entities. Now, this theory, of course, has also been criticized from the different point of view. For example, the Burke, the conservative British thinker Burke, he says that this theory looks at a state as a partnership agreement like any corporation, and therefore this is untenable. Now, Green, he believes that it looks at rights as independent of the state, and therefore, I mean, this theory suffers from a fallacy. So, I mean, this contract theory, of course, has been criticized, but no one can deny the importance and the significance of this theory for the political theory, particularly from the point of view of modern democratic rights and modern democratic order. The next theory is the force theory. Now, the force theory is basically the theory which believes that a state is the result of a superior force. Now, Voltaire statement is quite significant here when he said that the first king was a fortunate warrior. Now, what happened that there have been many proponents of this theory. It is not only Voltaire, but Oppenheimer, for example, in his book The State, he propounded this theory. Similarly, the Jenks, in his book History of Politics, he also argued that state is the result of human aggression or the superior force. Now, one important statement has come from Spencer when he says that a state, the state is the offspring of evil and bears the birthmark of its parentage. Now, even the Marxist theory also takes into account the role of force in creation of a state, though of course the Marxist theory of the origin of a state is slightly more profound and more historical, which we will take up later when we will come to the historical evolutionary theory of the state. But Engels also said something in similar vein when he said that force and iron ruthlessness basically helped in the consolidation of the state. Now, this theory is very simple, that it is the force and basically dominance of one on the other that this state authority or state power got legitimacy and got consolidated. So, basically it was the force which put human beings in a situation where they started obeying the orders of the other, and because of this forced obedience in course of time it culminated into this state authority or state power. Now, McIver is a critic of this theory and says that force alone cannot hold a group together for long. For temporarily, of course, one can submit to to force, but one cannot say that simply on basis of force a group can be held together, or for that matter a society can be held together, and therefore this explanation for the origin of a state is also not adequate. Now, the next theory is this patriarchal and matriarchal theory. Now, this patriarchal and matriarchal theory is basically a theory which tries to look at the evolutionary trajectory of this state, that how a state has evolved. Now, first this matriarchal theory, you have this Henry Mann, who is the chief advocate of this patriarchal theory. Now, Henry Mann argues that it was the eldest male descendant in the family who basically inherited the power, and it was basically his power which in course of time was turned into authority, and that authority gradually culminated into this state. Now, basically for men it is the state is nothing but family writ large. So, basically the argument is that it is the culmination of family into a state, that how family is run by the senior male member, male descendant, who he becomes the leader, and that leadership creates a kind of authority around it, and that authority in course of time is transformed into the state. Now, there is a matriarchal theory also, and this theory contests this male descendant, the patriarchal argument which I have just now mentioned. This matriarchal theory argues that it is not the male descendants who are basically responsible for the creation of this state authority. Rather, they would trace this entire origin from the point of view of the matriarchy, the female members of the family. So, for example, for MacLennan, it is a polyandry and the matriarchal family which was the first locus of this entire structure, state structure. Now, it was from polyandry to monogamous family, and from monogamous family it became the matriarchal family, and finally from matriarchal family it turned into patriarchal one. So, therefore, this line of succession has been from matriarchy to patriarchy, not from patriarchy to matriarchy. So, therefore, they would consider that matriarchal structure has been at the center of this evolution of the state. Now, Jenck, who is one of the proponent of this matriarchal theory, he argues that the Henry Main's conception needs to be reversed, because what he says is true, but the ordering has to be reversed, that it is not from patriarchy to matriarchy, rather from matriarchy to patriarchy. Now, for Jenck, the tribe was the earliest nucleus and or the primary group, then came the clan, from tribe it became clan, and from clan finally came the family, and from family it gradually moved in direction of the state. Now, what happened, that this is argued at times that this theory, this patriarchal and matriarchal theory, is more of a sociological than political in nature. Now, it explains more about the social organization, it tells more about the structure of family, structure of society than about the structure of state. So, I mean, of course, the role of this type of evolution from tribe to family to a state has been accepted by many thinkers, but considering it as the factor in the evolution of a state does not have many takers, and therefore, one has to move to the next important theory of the origin of a state, what is called historical evolutionary theory of the state, which basically looks at this evolution not from the point of view of any one particular factor, but from the point of view of different factors. The factors like kinship, factors like religion, factors like political consciousness, political factors like economic activity, and of course, force as well. So, what happens, that historical evolutionary is considered today the most acceptable theory, because this theory basically tells you that a state is is a story which tells you about this evolutionary pattern through which number of factors have contributed in the evolution of this organization called state. Now, what happens, that this historical evolutionary theory, the first important factor kinship has been the most important factor in this theory. Now, what is this kinship? Now, McIver is someone who says that kinship creates society and society at length creates the state. Now, it is basically the blood relationship, and this blood relationship, it is believed, has been very important in the evolution of this state power, that it is through the blood relationship, kinship within the tribe, which resulted into the larger expansion of this network, and therefore, gradually a family emerged, and from family other institutions crystallize, and finally, the entire thing moved in direction of a state. The next factor is religion. Now, religion is also considered a very important factor. Now, of course, it is well known that religion for the ancient people was not the religion the way today we look at it. Now, of course, it was animism, that they basically worshipped animals, they worshipped nature, but then finally from worshipping nature, because they could not explain natural phenomena, so they started worshipping it, believing it to be a god, unexplainable, and then gradually they moved in direction of worshipping ancestors. So, ancestor worship. Now, this is through these types of religious structures, these types of religious beliefs and faiths, that you have the tribal solidarity getting consolidated. Now, what happened, that finally the sanction of law and the primitive religion, sanction of law within the family, the law, I mean the customary law, and then the primitive religion, this is how this unity and obligation were created, particularly for the priestly class, and therefore, this entire discourse of obedience, law, authority, legitimacy, all these things revolved around this notion of religion. So, therefore, what happened, that religion started religion played a very significant role in course of time in consolidating this state authority and state power. The next important factor has been the political consciousness. Now, this political consciousness is basically the desire for power, ambition for power, and this is in fact is quite common in political theory these days to believe that it is basically the quest for power which basically motivates human beings for politics or for any human activity. Therefore, what happened that this quest for power that people were basically motivated towards such organization called state. The next important aspect is this economic activity. Now, economic activity is something which is very significant here, that how economic activity led to the consolidation of state. And according to this historical evolutionary theory, what happened that it takes a historical view of human history, that how human beings started their journey. For example, it is believed that they started their journey as huntermen and herdsmen, and then gradually what happened that this property and division of labor were created, and when this property and division of labor were created, then what happened, the differentiation of the social classes also took place, and finally agriculture came into existence, and then gradually these class differences and other factors, material conditions created a situation where this state power was required by the dominant and the propertied to dominate over the subordinate. Now, this argument has been central to the entire Marxist theory of the origin of state. Now, Marx of course, he himself did not write any book on this origin of state, but of course, his friend Engels authored a book, Family, Private Property and State. Now, what we find in this Marxist theory, that this economic activity or the material conditions of society are considered very important for the rise and origin of the state. Now, according to the Marxist theory, in fact, it tries to explain the entire thing from the point of view of material factors, that how material conditions, material factors are instrumental in creation of the state. Now, it takes a very hypothetical, of course, it basically construct a historical sketch of the human history, hypothetical of course, but nonetheless with that sketch it tries to arrive at certain conclusions or certain argument. So, that how human beings have started its journey. They started their journey as basically hunters, gatherers, as herdmen, but gradually, because within this framework the entire thing is seen from the point of view of two categories, the forces of production and relations of production. Now, the forces of production in the Marxist theory is the relationship between human beings and nature, and the relations of production is the relationship between human beings and one human and another human. So, basically the two types of relationship which is called in Marxist theory the mode of production, and it is with the help of this mode of production and the forces and relations that the Marxist theory tries to explain this theory of the origin of state. It says that human beings have started this journey as a hunter gatherer, but gradually, because there is a tendency of the growth of knowledge, because human being everything is in a stage of evolution, and human mind is also not an exception, it also evolves. So, what happens, this evolutionary Darwinian evolutionary theory which is used in this framework, it is believed that because of this evolutionary law, what happens that human mind also evolves, and because of this evolution, what happens that from gatherer, hunter, gatherer, basically man's capacity to fight with the nature started changing, because basically human mind is evolving. So, what happened that now human beings started discovering new tools and techniques, and therefore, what happens that his capacity to fight against nature also improved and changed. And with the changing nature of this fight, what happened that human beings became more basically capable in fighting against nature, and because of this new tools, new techniques, new method, new instruments, what happened that the entire relationship underwent changes. And because these relationships underwent changes, therefore material conditions, the productivity in society also changed, the economic activity changed. So from hunter gatherer it became a kind of agricultural community. So this is how this transition took place in ancient time. What happened that because of this transition, what happened that state, this transition, what happens that the relationship between one human being and another human being also changed. That is called relations of production, because in the initial phase when man was living life of a hunter and gatherer, in fact in this scheme of things it is called a primitive communism, that it was also a communist type of society where there was no exploitation, there was no inequality, but it was not by design but by default. By default, because people were not in a position to exploit others. So therefore it was a primitive communism. From primitive communism it started moving in direction of the class division and the class divided society, because now the material conditions started changing, because human beings knowledge improved, his capacity to fight against nature improves, his capacity to produce improved. So therefore all these factors led to this situation where the class divisions took place. When the class divisions took place, then it was no longer that primitive communist type situation. Now you had inequality and class disparities and exploitation. Therefore those who were dominant, they wanted to basically subordinate basically the weaker people, and therefore they created a kind of power relationship. And here Marxist theory would trace the origin of state, that how the powerful, the dominant, the propertied wanted to create an organization through which they could perpetuate their domination in society of the weaker people, and therefore the state became the instrument of the propertied and the dominant. Therefore this is the argument of Marxist theory about the function of a state also, that a state functions in the interest of the propertied class, it never functions in the interest of everyone. That is the position which liberal school of thought takes, that a state at times above class interests, it doesn't serve any particular interest, but it serves the interest of the entire society because it is above these considerations. But the Marxist school would always argue that a state origin has been in the class framework, because state came into existence to basically serve certain interests and purposes, and therefore it can never go beyond it, and that interest is basically most important and supreme for it, and a state will always function to fulfill those interests, that is the interest of the dominant and the propertied. Now this Marxist theory of the origin of a state, of course under this economic activity, as we have discussed in the historical evolutionary theory, is very significant. Of course many people would believe, or many people would argue, that it is the way the Marxist theory tries to reduce entire thing to this class thing is not true. There are other factors also. Of course this class dimension, the material dimension would have also played important role, but at the same time other factors were equally significant. For example, religion, force, political consciousness, kinship, and so on and so forth. But this debate of course goes on and on. But of course this theory of the origin of a state has also created a lot of debates on the functions of a state, that what type of functions state performs in society. Now those functions at times are seen from the point of its origin. Those who believe that a state has come into existence essentially for serving the interest of the entire society, for them a state is above the narrow interest, and therefore a state is basically class neutral. In fact, a state is an institution which tries to mediate the interest of various conflicting classes, and it is here the liberal school as it is commonly believed, which comprises of number of minor variations in this liberal discourse, but one thing is very common among these people, that state is one institution which is basically a institution which is above narrow considerations or class considerations. In fact, it has a mediatory role, it mediates various conflicting interests in society, and therefore, that mediation is possible only when it is above the narrow class interest. Whereas, this Marxist school, because it looks at its origin from the point of view of this class contradictions or the class conflicts, therefore, it will always argue that this mediation is not possible, because whenever a state functions, it functions on the behalf of the dominant, the propertied, and it is only because of its role as agency of the propertied class that a state basically can secure its existence in society. In fact, in that Communist Manifesto which Marx and Engels wrote, in fact, this famous paragraph that a state is the managing committee of the bourgeoisie. Of course, there is also another argument within the Marxist theory, that in certain circumstances, in exceptional circumstances, that a state attains autonomy from the dominant class, the propertied class, and that dominant class it attains autonomy when the class forces are evenly balanced in society, when the class conflict freezes, when the different classes and their capability basically are evenly matched. In that situation, a state can attain autonomy, and that of course is a historical situation which the Marxist theory explains with reference to the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. I mean, that is the book where this argument is put forth. So, I mean, this relative, I mean, they would never say that it is absolute autonomy, unlike the liberal theory. They would always say it is a relative autonomy, and it is a historical autonomy, that when there is a basically balance of class forces, when they are evenly balanced, there is no class in a position to dominate, in that condition a state attains this relative autonomy, and the moment again that dominance is established, the state would lose that relative autonomy and would start serving the interest of basically the dominant. So, I mean, the dominant perspective within the Marxist theory is of course the class perspective, that the state is the instrument of the bourgeoisie, whereas in the liberal perspective, as I mentioned, that it is believed that a state is above class interests, it has a mediatory role in society, it mediates the conflicting interests, and therefore, it is autonomous from the social forces. Now, what we have seen, that this theory of the origin of state, as well as the number of explanations about this its function, of course, have been the issue of debate in political theory. Now, what has happened, that this entire origin, I mean the question of origin has been seen from the point of view of its function, that what type of function it performs. Now, as I mentioned, that this social contract theory has been central for making a state a part of the democratic discourse, because now within social contract theory, as I have argued, that the state is considered to be the result of consent and contract, and therefore, it is not something which has come from outside. It is human beings' own creation to serve their own interest, and therefore, that is perhaps very significant for the rise and growth of modern democratic state, because here what is happening, that entire domain of sovereignty is transformed. Now, who is sovereign here in social contract? It is neither king nor the church nor the religion. It is basically the people, the human beings, the citizens who are sovereign. They have created this through their consent, and therefore, they have also the right to withdraw that consent. Therefore, you have the right to rebel, right to revolt, that you have created it, but if it doesn't serve your interests, you have within your right to withdraw your consent. So, therefore, this is perhaps considered a very important argument for the rise and growth of democratic society and democratic ideas. But nonetheless, it is of course believed that social contract theory is more of a hypothetical basically a theory which tries to tell you about certain philosophical truth, that it is not possible, it looks at times improbable that the state would have emerged through such contract at any point of time in history. But nonetheless, in fact what it conveys is something very significant, that it is there as part of human consent, and therefore this consent part is important. Now there are many things associated with the question of liberty, the question of rights, the question of law. All these issues which have become central to democratic discourse today are also integral to this contract theory. Now the other theory which I discussed, that is historical evolutionary theory, it is now universally accepted today that perhaps this is the most scientific way to explain the origin of a state, and how historically number of factors have played a role, contributed to the evolution of the state. Not one factor, but many factors. It is also kinship, it is force, it is religion, it is political consciousness and economic activity. So in course of time, with different evolutionary patterns, with number of factors contributing, and according to that contribution, this state authority, state power, state institutions got consolidated and got legitimized, and therefore this state as we see it today basically came into existence. So this is considered to be the most important theory so far as the explanation or to explain the origin of a state is concerned. I mean other things which we have discussed, the kinship, force, other things in isolation they do not carry much weight.